you did that study on GE and how GE was an outlier when it comes to CEO talent development.
Yeah.
So in this day and age, when we're struggling to attract talent, organizations are finding it hard to attract the best leaders. How does an organization become an excellent breeding ground for future leaders?
Yeah, it's a great question. And although we did that study, and although our results showed that shareholders certainly found that or believed that if you hired a CEO from GE, they would do better for you than if you hired a CEO from the normal labor market, the normal CEO labor market. Interestingly, we did a quick study that we did report on in that article that operationally, there didn't seem to be any difference between an ex-GE executive or a CEO hired from the normal labor market. So that leads to the question, and the question you're really asking is, where should boards of directors / CEOs look for their next successor? And based on the research I've done in the National Hockey League and other research I've read by a guy at Harvard, Boris Groysberg, who looked at star investment bankers, and anecdotal stories that have just happened to come my way, I really believe that organizations need to look inside their organizations to find their next leader. I don't know, if I can just offer an example from the National Hockey League, okay? The National Hockey League throughout its history has roughly 180 plus general managers, okay, in its 100-year history, 110-year history. There are 5 of them that I consider to be pretty good builders of Stanley Cup winners. Sam Pollock, Stan Bowman, Lou Lamoriello, Frank Selke, and who am I missing? I'm missing one. Oh, Ken Holland at Detroit. So make sure I get all 5 of those, okay? Now, Sam Pollock started with Montreal at the age of 22. After 16, 17 years, became the general manager. And in that period of time, he served in many functions in the front office, what's called the front office of the Montreal Canadiens, serving as assistant general manager before he took over as general manager. Now, in that period of time, Montreal won 6 Stanley Cups, and I'll come back to the general manager in a moment. And when Sam took over, he won a Stanley Cup in his first year and went on to win 9 more for a total of 10 Stanley Cups in 14 seasons as the general manager of the Montreal Canadiens. So an insider, had success immediately and went on to have future success. Ken Holland served for 12 years in the front office of the Detroit Red Wings, won a Stanley Cup in his first year and as general manager, and won a subsequent 2 more Stanley Cups, or built 2 Stanley Cup winners in his tenure as GM. Stan Bowman in Chicago served 9 years in the front office, the latter part of which he was the assistant general manager, and won in his first year as a general manager, and won another 2 as a general manager. Now, you may say, okay, they only won 3 and 3, but that was in an area where we had many more teams than what Sam Pollock. Sam Pollock went from 6 teams to 14 teams during his tenure. The others were at around 28, 30 teams. So those are 3 examples of those who were what I would call insiders. So they really knew the organization when they became general manager. Now I compare them to Sam Pollock's predecessor as general manager, a guy named Frank Selke Sr. And Frank served 19 seasons as the assistant general manager to Conn Smythe in Toronto, with the Toronto Maple Leafs. Came to Montreal in 1946, served there for 18 seasons as general manager, retiring in 64 when Sam took over. And in that 18-year period, he won 6 Stanley Cups and got to the finals 11 times. So very successful as a general manager. What's interesting is he came in 46. He did not win his first Stanley Cup until, I'm going to say 52, 53, about 7-year period before he won his first Stanley Cup with the Montreal Canadiens. And then I look at Lou Lamoriello. Lou Lamoriello came from university hockey. He'd been a hockey player in university, captained his team, became a coach at the same university, and went on to become the athletic director. Then got hired to be the team president of the New Jersey Devils, which at the time Wayne Gretzky described as being the laughingstock of the NHL, and then hired himself as the general manager. He successfully led the New Jersey Devils. He successfully built 3 Stanley Cup winners in his tenure. But you know what? It took him 8 years before he won his first Stanley Cup.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the way I explain it is that in the case of Frank Selke and in the case of Lou Lamoriello, it took them 7, 8 years, respectively, to become insiders. But here's the kicker. The average tenure of those general managers throughout the 180 some odd general managers in the National Hockey League is roughly 5 years. So in other words, if you want to turn someone you hire as a general manager into an insider, based on those 2 anecdotal stories, you have to give them longer than the average tenure of a general manager. So it's important that they be insiders. And if you hire an outsider, you've got to give that outsider a time to become an insider. And why do you need that? Because they have to learn the organization inside out before they can affect change that will turn the organization around and turn it into a winner.
Yeah.
Now, does that apply to other organizations? I believe it does. I was explaining all of this to a guy in a bar one night when I was at a conference. I went down to the bar to have supper, got talking to this guy, and he looked at me afterwards. He said, "You have just explained why when I hire a star from one of my competitors, they're not a star in my organization." You know, so, you know, and I've had a couple of anecdotal stories like that from practitioners when I've talked about this stuff. This guy at Harvard, Boris Kreuzberg, he talked about star investment bankers. He, as part of his dissertation research, he studied about 1,100, roughly almost 1,100 investment bankers, about 900, and let's say 850 males and 200 females. What he found was that all of them had been assessed as star investment bankers by a third-party agency for their respective investment banks. And what he was interested in was when these 1,100 investment bankers transferred to another investment bank, did they again become stars at their second investment bank? Okay. What he found was that there was a significant drop-off in the proportion of those who became stars. And it was a statistically significant drop-off, even 5 years after they each had transferred.
Wow.
And what he argued was that the reason there was this drop-off was because they left what made them a star behind at their first organization. About 70% of what made them a star at the first organization was left at that organization. They only took about 30% with them. But one of the intriguing differences, though, he found that the drop-off for males, which was much deeper than the drop-off for females. So what he suggested as an explanation for that difference was that males were able to build their networks internally inside their original investment banks. Females at the time, because of, quote, the old boys network, weren't able to build that internal network. So they built external networks.
Right.
Well, external networks were easier to transfer than internal networks, which comes back to that 70% of what makes someone a star in their original firm. Maybe it was only 50% for the female investment bankers. Now, the female investment still fell off, but the drop wasn't as deep as it was for males.
Yeah.
So those are 2 very different industries that illustrate that in being an insider is probably going to, you know, if you can develop people from inside your firm to lead your firm, that's probably the best route to go.
Right.
Now what GE was able to do was to develop leaders who other firms wanted as a CEO, and GE was by far the best, quote, CEO school of any organization. You know, particularly during Jack Welch's tenure. they were what you might call a finishing school for CEOs.
Right, right. And do you believe most organizations are doing enough to train, to mentor, to groom, to coach, to support middle management to move into those roles?
That's a great question. I think the top tier organizations do that. I think organizations like RBC here in Canada, GE under Jack Welch, Procter and Gamble, those three come to mind right off the top of my head. I think they do a really good job because I've studied those three organizations. I'm sure there are other organizations as well that do a really good job, but those three in particular, I study them, so I know that they do a good job of preparing people for senior positions. But one of the things I studied when I examined RBC, typically when you think of RBC and their big business, let me call them business segments. Okay, so you've got personal and commercial banking, you've got wealth management, and you've got capital management, I think it is. Guess where their leaders of those big business segments come from? They come from inside the business segments.
Right. There's a lot of internal.
Okay. They have never, to my knowledge, in the last 25, 30 years, they have never taken someone from personal and commercial banking, the leader of personal and commercial banking, and put them in charge of capital markets or wealth management. Okay. If they want a leader for wealth management, now they will consider them, but they will generally pick someone from wealth management to run wealth management, someone from capital markets to run capital markets, someone from personal and commercial banking to run personal and commercial banking.
Yeah.
And the only time they take someone out of one of those three big business segments is when they make that person the CEO.